In this video we shall discuss how to use triggers to ensure data consistency. First, we have to emphasize that while this topic looks similar to the previous one, here we are concentrating on the idea of keeping some aggregate field up to date in the fastest way possible. And in the first task we have to modify subscribers table to store the number of books taken by each subscriber and keep the data up to date the fastest way possible. After we complete this task, the subscribers table should contain such a field, and that field should store the number of books taken by each subscriber. The first step of this solution looks familiar. We have to alter this table and we have to add that column to store that data. Then we have to initialize data in our table, so we are executing such query. The only difference here from the previous topic is that we initialize values with zeros, it as non-books are taken by a subscriber, instead of nulls, it as a subscriber has never been to the library. From now on we shall skip the code for trigger deletion, but you may easily find that code in previous topics. So the first trigger we are creating here should react to insert operations on the subscriptions table. Here we have to take into account only active subscriptions, then we have to find out the ID of the subscriber and we have to increment the counter by 1. This query works fast because we are only modifying the data for that exact subscriber with the new subscription, and we do not recalculate the whole data set. We are only incrementing that counter by 1, and that's extremely fast. The next trigger should react to deletion from subscriptions table. Here we are also taking into account only active subscriptions, we are finding out the ID of the corresponding subscriber, and we are decrementing the counter by 1. Now we have to create the most complicated trigger here, the one that reacts to update on subscriptions table. Here we have to take into account several different situations. If the subscriber stays the same but the subscription changes its state from active to inactive, we have to decrement the counter for that subscriber. If the subscriber is the same but the subscription changes its state from inactive to active, we have to increment the counter for that subscriber. If the subscriber changes but the subscription state stays the same, we have to decrement the counter for old subscriber and increment the counter for new subscriber. And finally, if the subscriber changes and the subscription state changes from active to inactive, we have to decrement the counter for old subscriber. While if the subscriber changes and the subscription state changes from inactive to active, we have to increment the counter for new subscriber. If this explanation was not enough, here's the visual one. Here we have situations for the same subscriber, for different subscribers. Here we see the old and the new value of the subscription state. Here we see the action we have to perform. And here we see the corresponding letter in comments of code blocks of that trigger we've already seen. And of course, in MySQL we need additional trigger because cascade operations do not activate triggers in this DBMS. That's why we need a trigger that reacts to deletion from books table. As a subscriber may have taken several copies of some books, we have to calculate how many copies of that book he has taken, and then we decrement the counter by that value. Also, please notice that the only situation we need to analyze here is the deletion of books, as neither insertion nor modification of books do not influence books count per subscriber. And finally, please create all those triggers in your DBMS and write some queries to test how the triggers work. And we are continuing with Microsoft SQL Server. We also have to alter that table to add such a field into that table, and then we have to initialize the data by executing such query. In Microsoft SQL Server, triggers are statement level ones. That's why for after insert trigger we have to rely on that inserted virtual table. We are taking only active subscriptions into account, and then we are counting how many books were taken by a subscriber, and then we increment the counter by that value. In after delete trigger we are also taking into account only active subscriptions. We are relying on that deleted virtual table, so the table stores the old information that is being deleted now. Then we are counting how many books were returned by a subscriber and we are decrementing the counter by that value. For after update trigger in Microsoft SQL Server, we may just use the code for delete trigger and the insert trigger. So first, taking into account the information from this table, we are analyzing only active subscriptions and we are counting how many books were returned by a subscriber, and then we are decrementing the counter by this value. Then we are using the information about new values for each record. We are taking into account only active subscriptions, we are counting how many books were taken by a subscriber, and we are incrementing that counter by that value. And that's all. Now it's only a good idea to test how all these triggers work. With Oracle, we have to follow MySQL approach. First, we shall alter the table and add that field. Then we have to initialize the data by executing such query. And then we shall use row-level triggers. This one should react to insert operations on subscriptions table. Once an active subscription is inserted, we have to find out the ID of the subscriber and increment the counter by 1 for that subscriber. If a subscription was deleted and that subscription was in active state, we have to find out the ID of the subscriber and decrement the counter by 1. And once a subscription was updated, we have to take into account all those situations we were discussing in MySQL solution. So please refer to MySQL solution for detailed explanation on all these situations. And of course, try to write some queries to test all these triggers. In the next task, we have to modify genres table to store the number of books in each genre and keep the data up to date, and of course, we shall do it the fastest way possible. This is the expected result, and we see that in genres table a new column has appeared and it contains the information about how many books are there in each genre. Of course, the first step is familiar. We have to alter our table and we have to add such a column to store that data. Then we have to initialize the data by executing such query. Then we have to work with this table that contains information about connections between books and genres. So once a new connection between books and genres is inserted, we have to find out the ID of corresponding genre and increment the counter by 1 for that genre. If this table was updated, it as a book was taken from one genre and added to another genre, we have to decrement the counter for the old genre and increment the counter for the new one. And if a connection between a book and a genre was deleted, we have to find out the ID of that genre and decrement the counter for that genre by 1. And of course, once again, in MySQL we need additional trigger, because cascade operations do not activate triggers in this DBMS. It asks if a book was deleted, its connection with genres was deleted also, so we have to find out all the genres of that book and decrement the counter for the genres for each genre by 1. Of course, the only situation we need to analyze here is the deletion of books, as neither insertion nor modification of books do not influence books count per genre. And yes, please do not forget to write queries to test such triggers and any other solution in our videos. With Microsoft SQL Server we also have to alter our table and add such a column into that table. Then we have to initialize the data by executing such query. Then we have to create several triggers. So in the first one we have to react to insert operation on this table that stores connections between books and genres. Because in Microsoft SQL Server triggers are statement level ones, we have to use that virtual inserted table to find out the information about genres IDs and about how many books were added to each genre. And then we have to increment the counter by that value. If the information about connections between books and genres was updated, we have to make a trick here. For each genre we have to calculate how many books were removed from that genre, and also how many books were added to this genre. Then using these temporary values we may calculate the final delta of books for each genre. And we are using that value to modify the counter for each genre. If some connections between some books and some genres were deleted, we have to calculate how many books were deleted for each genre, and then we have to decrement the counter by that value. And finally, the solution for Oracle. Here we also have to alter our table and add such a field to store that data. Then we have to initialize the data by executing such query. Then we are following MySQL approach. For each insertion to this table, we are finding out the identifier of a genre and we are incrementing the counter by 1 for that genre. In the update situation, when a book was moved from one genre to another, we have to increment the counter for the new genre and decrement the counter for the old one. And if a connection between a book and a genre was deleted, we have to find out the ID of that genre and decrement the counter for that genre by 1. And also please pay attention that while Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle activate triggers by cascade operations, we do not need that additional trigger on books table as we needed in MySQL. And finally, once again, it's a good idea to test all these triggers by executing corresponding queries, so please write such queries yourself.